Hi, it's Rob from the Brush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a short tutorial on how to paint the Master of Possession from the Shadowspear box set. Now it's a great miniature with loads of details on it, and the fire and flames from it have been used in another video from last week, so I'll link that in as we go along. So the first colour that we're going to be using is Citadel Mephiston Red, and you can see already that I've used some of it to paint the cloak behind his legs. Now if you've already built him and he's just undercoated matte black, it's no worries, you can just poke a brush in there to get it. But I thought while it was open, I'll paint it that way. And then we're just going to carry on painting the rest of the cloak with Mephiston Red. When we come back, we'll have all of this red finished. The next colour that we're going to use is Vallejo Burnt Umber. Now it's a nice dark brown colour, and we're going to be using that to do the wooden staff and also his holster for his pistol. When we come back, we'll have all the burnt umber finished. Now the next colour is going to be Citadel Rakarth Flesh, and that is going to be used to do all the bone on it. Now there is a lot of skulls on this guy. His helmet's a skull, he's got skulls on his necklace, he's got a skull on his staff, on his backpack, hanging from his cloak, so there is plenty to do Rakarth Flesh with on this. When we come back, we'll have all the Rakarth Flesh finished. Next up is Citadel Wazdakka Red, and we're just going to do a little piece of his staff with this. Now it's got like a little strap bits where his hand is gripping it, and I wanted to paint them in Wazdakka Red because it's kind of like it reminds me of all the Imperial weapons, and that's what colour I usually do the Imperial weapons, so it's kind of a bit of a hat tip to those. Like so. Now we're using some Citadel Liberator gold. Now I've changed the way I paint the gold on the Black Legion since the original video, so I'm going to do a more updated version of that video soon, in that I'm using this gold, so it's a more lighter shade of gold rather than Retributor armour, which is quite a dark shade of gold. So we're going to be using both on this model, but for the trim of the armour I'm going to be using Liberator gold throughout. And when we come back, we'll have all the Liberator gold finished. Continuing with metallics now, we're going to move on to Citadel Leadbelcher. Now whereas you usually do metallics with Vallejo Modeler Chrome or similar, I'm using Citadel Leadbelcher for this because it always gives good coverage and it's also that bit darker. Now I want to try and keep the Black Legion figures looking quite dark so they look a bit more sinister. So rather than using the chrome on any of them, I'll be using the Leadbelcher. And when we come back, we'll have all the Leadbelcher finished. Now we're using Citadel Retributor armour. That's a nice darker gold colour. I'm going to be using that for the 8 pointed stars which he's got on the top of his staff and coming out of the top of his backpack. When we come back, we'll have all the Retributor armour finished. Next, it's Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey. That's just going to be to do the horns on the skull of his staff, and also some of the smaller details like the runes and stuff around him. When we come back, we'll have all the Mechanicus standard grey finished. The next colour we're going to use is Citadel Mournfang brown. We're just going to use a little bit of that to do the grip of his pistol. This is just being used to break it up from the colour of the holster because it does look like a wooden handle. Like so. Now we're just going to use a little bit of Averland Sunset, and this is just going to be to do the two eyes of Horus, the one on his knee, and then there's one on his backpack as well. Like so. Now we're moving on to Vallejo White. Now you can use any white for this. We're just going to be using it to do the flames. Now I always start the flames with a pure white base colour. So I tend to use a smaller brush to do the very tips of the flames and the bits where the flame works its way down, the skulls and things like that. And then I use a larger brush to paint the bulk of the flame because there is quite a lot there, and because you usually have to do a couple of layers of white, then it's best to use a bigger brush for those parts. That doesn't mean you have to plaster the paint on really, really thick, just use the same amount you usually would. It'll just give you better coverage with the larger brush. When we come back, we'll have all of the white finished. The first shade that we're going to use is Citadel Wazdakka shade. I'm going to use that to paint all the golds and also the inside of his cloak. I ordinarily do the cloak using Citadel Violet, but because the inside looks a little bit leathery and darker on the miniature, I've just decided to do that with a Wazdakka shade, and then I'll give it another wash a bit later just to darken that up. When we come back, we'll have all the Wazdakka shade finished. Now we're going on to Seraphim Sepia. I'm going to be using this to do all of the skulls, and also to do the little ties like he's got around his holster and around the dagger on his waist. It's always worth noting as we come to the end of doing all the shades and stuff how different the model looks from the unshaded to the shaded version, so I'm going to do a post on that in a few weeks to show how that looks. When we come back, we'll have all of this shade finished. The next shade that we're going to use is Citadel Null Oil. We're going to be using that to do the horns, any of the silvery metallics, and also to darken up some of the areas like the inside of his cloak. So we're going to be using Null Oil just down the creases on the inside of his cloak, just to get that a little bit darker so it looks a good contrast to the outside of his cloak. We're also using it on the skulls on his backpack as well, where they're burning. When we come back, we'll have all the Null Oil finished. Now we're going back to a Wazdakka shade, and that's just because we're going to darken down some of the bone areas, mainly like the horns that are coming from the side of his helmet. We want to get them a bit darker so that they stand out against the rest of the bone. Also give another coat to the inside of his cloak as well, just to darken that up and give it a bit more of a brown look. And when we come back, we'll have all of this shade finished. Now we're just going to shade the outside of his cloak using Citadel Violet, wavering about in the background there. This is always the way that I paint cloaks. I've just found it to be a really effective way of shading them, and then by adding the red layers on top of it, it does give you a really nice looking red. When we come back, I'll have all of the Violet finished. We're now going to be working on the flames. We're going to be using quite a few shades to do these. The first shade that we're going to use is Citadel Cassandora Yellow. We're then going to follow that with Citadel Fugen Orange, and then we're going to go on to Citadel Carroburg Crimson. So starting off with the Cassandora Yellow, we're going to apply that pretty liberally across the whole of the flames. You want to take it down to almost where it's coming out of the skull, and then further up you can let that pool in the recesses a bit more because it makes it go a nice orangey colour, which even with just the one layer makes it look a little bit fiery. When we come back, we'll have all the Cassandora Yellow finished. Now we're just going to be going on to Fugen Orange. Now with this layer, what you want to be doing is painting it further up than the yellow was, so you still leave yellow around the bottom of the flames, and then it starts getting darker towards the top. Now the same way you let the Cassandora Yellow pool, you want to do the same with the Fugen Orange, so that darkens up the middle recesses of the flame a lot more. Then you can use a thinner coating of Fugen Orange just to work your way down the higher parts of the flame. When we come back, we'll have all this layer finished. So you can see here where I've had a little bit of a video malfunction and I've started to paint it without it recording. So you can see a couple of the flames have got Carroburg Crimson at the top, but what we're now going to do for this layer is we're going to carry on the flames that I haven't painted and show you those. So it's Carroburg Crimson, and we're just adding the next layer to it. Now the same way that you did with the orange, you want to be adding the Carroburg Crimson to the top of the flames, higher up than the orange, again leaving the shade to pool in the recesses, and also adding thinner layers of Carroburg Crimson over the raised parts of the flame. And this gives it that sort of deeper, more coloured look within the recesses and the lighter shades on the top. When we come back, we'll have all the Carroburg Crimson finished. The next colour that we're going to use is a Grax Earth shade, which is a dark brown shade from Citadel. What we're going to do in here is just sort of darkening up the very tips of the flames and around sort of about halfway down the Carroburg Crimson. And the reason I use this is it darkens it up enough and sort of gives it a middle colour between the red and the black, which will be the sort of the smoky part at the top. So just add a little bit of a Grax Earth shade. You can do that quite thick in the recesses at the very top, but you don't want to go too far down and darken up the whole flame. When we come back, we'll have all your Grax Earth shade finished. Now I'm just using Citadel Nuln Oil mixed with Vallejo Black. Now any black will do, but it's basically 2 blobs of Nuln Oil to a tiny bit of black, like a paintbrush tip of black, and that has given it the runny consistency we need to be able to spread it onto the flames without completely covering the colour, but enough to give it that dark, matte, smoky effect that you want at the tip of your flames. When we come back, we'll have all this colour finished. The final thing that we're going to do is return to Citadel Cassandora Yellow, and all we're doing here is spreading it down from where we applied it earlier, down the white sections of flame, so there's only a tiny little bit white left at the bottom. You can also pool a little bit more Cassandora Yellow into the recesses, and this will help it blend into the darker Fugen Orange. When we come back, we'll have all the Cassandora Yellow finished. Now we're just going to be using a little bit of Vallejo Red wash. Now the reason I'm using this to do part of his cloak is, if you look at the picture of the cloak, there's a slight red tint to it, and I really wanted to get it so that it wasn't too dark. Now the red wash is a lot lighter than the Games Workshop Carroburg Crimson, so I figured I'd use that instead, and then it'd just give it that pink tinge without being too dark. Like so. Now we're just going to return to Nuln Oil again, and that's just to darken up the horns on his helm. Now we are jumping between shades back and forth, but it's because of the way he's painted up and the way you want to get him looking. You do have to do certain layers underneath other layers, but it's pretty quick with the shades. Like so. Going back to the base colours now, we're going to start with Citadel Rakarth Flesh. I'm just going to put the colour back onto all the bone sections. We're also going to use it to gently highlight the burning skulls at the top, but really light. You only want a few little hints of Rakarth flesh on them. You don't want to do a layer or put too much on, just like a really fine highlight over the edges of some of the raised areas. When we come back, we'll have all the Rakarth flesh finished. Now, because there's so much bone on the model and so much detail on the bone, I thought I'd just do an extra little section reapplying some of the Rakarth flesh. And this is solely just so you can see a lot of the details on it and how I'm painting those, rather than just seeing bits of the skull being painted or what have you. And this time when we come back, the Rakarth flesh will be finished. Now we're going to use some Vallejo Black, and this is just to redo all the black on his armour where we may have gone over it with little bits of the gold, or where the spray undercoat hasn't actually coated the plastic properly. So we're just going to go over that, make sure he's all black there, and we can carry on with the rest of the model. Like so. Now we've just mixed a little bit of Ushabti bone to the Rakarth flesh. I'm going to start on the first layer of highlights on the bones. I'm going to do quite a few layers on these because there is a lot of detail. I don't want them all to have the same kind of highlights or the same level of highlights. So as we go through, you'll see certain parts are getting highlighted, other parts might not, as the different layers of highlight get further on. When we come back, we'll have this layer finished. Now we've just added a little bit of white to the previous mix. I'm going to carry on doing the highlights on all the bone. And when we come back, we'll have all of this highlight finished. Now we're returning to Citadel Mephiston Red, and we're going to start working on his cloak. Now the first layer after the shade is the largest of them all. You'll put plenty of the red back on, but I always try to leave a little bit of shadow if there's anything overhanging the cloak, so where the bones are there, or the holster, or the scroll, leave a little bit of shade beneath that. And then you also want to leave the shade within the recesses on the cloak, just to give it that darker area where it's folded in itself. And when we come back, we'll have all of this layer finished. Now we've just added some Citadel Fire Dragon Bright to the Mephiston Red, and all we're doing for this layer is leaving some of the Mephiston Red showing. We're going to add a highlight to all the raised areas. So as you can see on his knee there, we've done over the top of where the ridge of his knee would be, and then some of the streaks, and then we're working on the areas which would be catching the light if the light was shining down above. When we come back, I'll have all of this mix finished. Again, we've added some more Fire Dragon Bright to the mix, and we're going to do another highlight on his cloak. Now same again with this layer, you want to be covering less area than on the previous layer, so that you can see all of the previous layers built up beneath it, and that'll give it a nice blend of colour. Like so. Now we've just added more Fire Dragon Bright to the previous mix, and we're going to do the final layer on his cloak. And all this is going to be to do some highlights on the holes at the base of the cloak, just to make it look as though it's catching the light. So all you want to be doing is using a little tiny bit of paint on the very tip of your brush, and just highlighting the bottom edges on each of the holes. That just makes it look like the light's catching it from above. When we come back, we'll have all of the highlights finished. Now we're returning to Mechanicus Standard Grey, and all we're using this for is to reapply the colour to the grey areas, making sure that you leave some of the Nuln Oil shade in the recesses. When we come back, we'll have all of the grey finished. Now we've just added some white to the Mechanicus Standard Grey, and we're now going to highlight all the areas that we just repainted. And when we come back, we'll have all these highlights finished. Now we've just added a bit more white to the previous mix, and we're going to do another highlight on the grey. When we come back, we'll have all the grey finished. Now we're returning to Citadel Retributor Armour, and we're going to work on the gold. When we come back, we'll have all the gold finished. Now we're moving on to Citadel Liberator Gold, and this is going to be to highlight the Retributor armour that we've just applied, and also to colour in the gold trim that we did earlier. Now again, you can see as we're going through this that the 8 pointed stars that we painted in Retributor armour to begin with is a darker gold than the rest of the trim that we're filling in here. So it does separate them out quite nicely. Also, if you do manage to get any of the metallics onto the black, you can just add another touch of black before we go on to painting that later. And when we come back, we'll have all the Liberator gold finished. Now we've just added some Vallejo Model Air Chrome to the Liberator gold, and we're just going to do some small highlights on the Retributor armour gold and also the Liberator gold. Now we're just doing this on sort of the top edges and the edges that be catching the light, just to give it a bit more shine than the Liberator gold gives on its own. When we come back, we'll have all the chrome mix finished. Now I'm just going to use some pure Vallejo Model Air Chrome just to do the links that are holding on the teeth and the runes to the cables. Nice dodgy bit of camera work there. Like so. Next we're going to move on to Vallejo German Grey. Now it's a great colour this for highlighting black. I find that sometimes you see models and they've been highlighted with lots of greys and it makes the black just look grey. But with this one it's dark enough that you can highlight the black and leave a lot of black on there, and it doesn't detract from it and take it away and make it just look like a very dark grey all over the model. Now again, we're just doing the uppermost surfaces and some of the edges just to give them that highlight as though they're catching the light from above. When we come back, we'll have all the German Grey finished. Now we've just added a tiny little bit of white to the German Grey just to make it that little bit lighter. We're now just going to highlight where we put the German Grey earlier on. When we come back, we'll have all this highlight finished. Again, we're going to be using a little bit of Model Air Chrome here, and that's just to do the band that's going around his arm, which I hadn't spotted earlier. Apologies for the dodgy camera work there. Now that we've finished that, we're just going to use a little bit of Citadel Rakarth flesh, and we're going to do the ties that are on his gloves. Like so. I've just added a little bit more white to that grey mix. I'm just going to use it to do a few little edge highlights just at the very top to break up the colour of his arms. When we come back, we'll have all of those finished. Now we're moving on to Vallejo London Grey. I'm just going to do a quick coat of this on the ridges on his blade. And when we come back, we'll have all the London Grey finished. Now we're just going to use Vallejo White. I mean, you can use pretty much any white for this. It's just to do a few little spot highlights on the ridges on the blade. So where all the London Grey lines join up, we're just going to put little spots of white on there just to make it look like they're catching the light a little bit more. Like so. Now we're going to use Vallejo Burnt Umber. We're just going to use that to add colour back to his holster and also back to his staff. When we come back, we'll have all the burnt umber finished. Now we're moving on to Averland Sunset. We're just going to use this on the two Eyes of Horus, the one on his knee and also the one on his backpack. Like so. We're now moving on to Yriel Yellow, and that's just going to be to do the more central area of the Eyes of Horus. Like so. Now we're going to be using a bit of fugen orange shade. I'm just going to do that around the outside edges of the Eye of Horus, leaving the centre as yellow as you can. Like so. And now we're going to be using a little bit of Vallejo Black, and that's just to put the eye, the vertical pupil of the eye, onto each Eye of Horus. Like so. Now we're just going to use Vallejo White, coming in from a distance there, and we're just going to use that to paint the eyeballs on the staff. Like so. Now we're going to use Citadel Carrowbird Crimson, and this is just to give the eyes a glowing look to them. So what you want to be doing is you want to be getting quite a bit of Carrowbird Crimson around each of the eyes, and then just a little tiny bit onto the eyeball itself. And you can use a tiny little bit of it around the underside of the eyeball and around the top, just to make it look as though it's glowing. And now what you want to do is get a little bit of pure white, just add a little spot of that to the middle again, and it'll give it that kind of glowing look. Like so. Now we're just going to return to Mephiston Red, and that's to do his eye lenses. Apologies for the dodgy camera work. Now we've added a little bit of white to Mephiston Red, and we're just going to do a little bit of a highlight on the lens, doing this towards the back end of the lens, to leave the front end a little bit darker. Now we're just going to add some pure white, and we're going to do a reflection on the front of his lenses. Like so. Okay, now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Rakarth flesh on the burning skulls. What we're going to try and do here is add some really light highlights to the skulls. So just a tiny little bit of Rakarth flesh on the brush, watered down if you need to, so it's really thin, and just put little tiny highlights onto that skull. And then we're going to move on to using Cassandora Yellow, and with that we're going to colour in all those little bits of Rakarth flesh that you've just put on. And that just gives it a slightly yellow glow to the skulls, and also do that to the highlights on the front as well. Like so. The final colour that we're going to use on him is Citadel Fugen Orange Shade, and that's just going to be to add some darker flame colours to the highlights that we just put on the skulls. Like so. And that is the finished Master of Possessions. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also think about subscribing to some of our other social media, link below. Thanks very much.